Welcome back to another month of Maddie's Baking Book Club. This month, July 2023, our book was chosen by Sadie at the Happy Mac. You can find her on Instagram and on TikTok. She makes some really great macarons and is also a really avid reader. She has been really into fantasy recently and has been encouraging me to read a lot more fantasy recently. So I was not surprised at all when she came back to me with this book, The Serpent and the Wings of Night. And this book is a fantasy romance about vampires. It's a whole new world. It is very intense, quite violent, and because we have vampires who are at war and fighting with each other and with humans, and of course there's a lot of blood, both from the violence and from vampires being vampires, I decided that my book Inspired Bake was going to really focus on the kind of vampire aspect, just all of the red and then the dark. And so to get an inside, a filling for the macaron shell, I combined some pomegranate juice with some raspberries, a little bit of sugar and some pectin, and I'm just giving that a really good boil. In the very beginning, I was thinking about maybe dipping this into like a Kappa carrageenan coating or like a gelatin coating or something, and then having it be like a burst of some kind of liquid. And then my plans got away from me. And so then I did end up adding a little bit of gelatin to this later. And because I emulsified in the gelatin, it did lighten the color just a little bit. But the inside is supposed to represent blood. So I have this pomegranate raspberry gel for the inside of the macaron. That's going to rest while I'm creating my macaron shell. Now, to create the blackest black macaron shell that I can without using way too much food coloring, I'm still going to use a lot, but I want to try to use as little as I can. I am making a cocoa powder base macaron shell, then adding in my first powdered black food colorant into my meringue. Then as I whip this up and I realized like, okay, it's gonna be gray, I added in a little bit more powder, and then I started adding in some black gel food colorant as well. Otherwise, it is just a very normal French method for macaron shells, just a lot of food coloring. If you have never made a really, really dark colored shell before, I do want to give you a couple warnings here. Yes, with this amount of food coloring, it is going to stain your mouth a bit. That's just how it is. It's kind of unavoidable. So if you are making this for a custom order or for an event or anything like that, definitely give people a warning, especially if it's a fancier event. Otherwise, just know, I mean, it's just food coloring, it's going to be okay. It will go away. As you eat other things and just with time. It's not a permanent mouth staining. So then the other thing to keep in mind is that especially when you're adding in a lot of gel food colorant, that amount of moisture can actually deteriorate the structure of the shells if you add way too much. So using at least a mixture of powder and liquid gel food colorant is a really good idea. Otherwise, trying to use as much of the powdered food colorant in your meringue is really, really a good idea. I am piping these shells just like I normally would because all of the decoration is going to come from some wafer paper, which I will be decorating and attaching after the macaron shells are baked. Then all of the really like red blood vampire vibes, that's coming from the filling, both in a buttercream and then in that pomegranate raspberry gel that I'm putting right in the center. Even with this super dark colored macaron, with all of that food coloring and the cocoa and everything, I still bake these for about the normal amount of time, maybe just a touch longer, but nothing too crazy. But do be careful not to add too much food coloring. Now that my macaron shells are ready to go, it's time to create my decorations. So I have some red and black food colorant. I have a little bit, at first I have not really used wafer paper much, so at first I tried water and then I realized that was a mistake, so I used a tiny bit of alcohol. But I'm just using a clean pastry brush and then mixing my gel food colorants with a little bit of water just to get it a little bit more so it can soak into my pastry brush a little bit better. And then I can paint a very thin layer of that onto my wafer paper. And then what I did was I allowed this to dry just a touch, and then I stacked parchment paper on top of it and put heavy pans so it would stay as flat as possible and it wouldn't wrinkle up. You really want to be careful when you're working with wafer paper not to add too much liquid. It's kind of a little bit similar to a macaron shell in that way, but I wanted a really intense red and black. So it took a little bit of trial and error to figure out how much paint, how much food coloring gel I could get on my paintbrush and how much I could get onto my wafer paper without it being a mistake. So it was a little bit of a fun yet kind of stressful art project. It is something that I would recommend playing around with because it is a really fun decoration. Unless you are doing something vampire vibes like I am, I wouldn't necessarily recommend using this much, especially black and red food coloring, but it was perfect for this bake. Then because I wanted an effect that looked like wings and gave you the appearance and the feeling of wings, I got this feather paper punch, and then I'm using that to punch out after the food coloring and everything is completely dried, the wafer paper is completely dry. I'm just punching out a ton of those feathers, and then I'm going to use just a touch of water to carefully attach all of these colored feathers to my macarons after I have everything ready to go. In the story, we have a lot of different groups of vampires and friends and foe, and there's this competition. There's a lot of stuff going on. People are at war. People are competing with each other. And all throughout all of this, we have kind of one throne, one king, and different groups, different clans identify a representative to be the next in line for a potential someone who could sit on the throne, and this mark appears, and some of these colors that show when somebody has the power to become a king, to sit on this throne, it shows up in red. So partially because the book was really moody and intense, and then there was a lot of violence, I wanted to use black and red. And then also because of the coloring of some of these vampires and their, physical appearance, the wings that some of them had, and then also these air marks and things like that. Again, I wanted to use black and red. It just seemed to be a recurring theme throughout these books, these really dark, moody vibes and colors. And so I had some of my macarons that I completely covered, again, just using a touch of water to attach the painted wafer paper onto my macaron shells, being careful not to use too much. I don't want to disintegrate the wafer paper or the shell. Some of them I did in all black, some of them I did in black and red, and then I think a couple I did in a really deep red, and then a few of them, because even though it is really pretty to look at, it's not really something you want to eat. These were more accent macarons. I had a couple wafer paper feathers that I had either in black or in a really deep red or even in gold that I attached just like 1 or 2 or 3 to a couple other macarons. And those would be things that would be a lot easier to actually eat and still have the vibe of this book, be book-inspired bakes, without being really cumbersome to actually enjoy. So as soon as I get all of these feathers attached to my macarons, I'm going to make my buttercream and finish up these shells. For the buttercream, I wanted to keep it really simple, so I had some vanilla buttercream in my fridge already, so I'm repurposing that and just adding a whole bunch of pomegranate flavoring from Amaretti. To get a really, really dark color, I melted just a little bit of the buttercream, added in my food colorant. I would have used an oil-based food colorant for buttercream if I had it in red. I did not have it in red, but I added that in. It was a little bit too cherry red vibes for me, so I did add in some black because I wanted it to be moodier. But otherwise, this was really great. I think the pomegranate amaretti flavor is a really good flavor. Please be careful though. This brand, along with a lot of other flavoring brands, not every flavor is created equal, so please make sure to taste test to make sure that you're not creating something that tastes like bubblegum when you want it to taste like a fruit or something. How cool are these macarons looking? So I have all my finished shells. The wafer paper details have dried on there. I'm piping a ring of that pomegranate buttercream. Again, I know there's a lot of food coloring in there. It is what it is. We are just going with it. Then on the inside, I did again add a little bit of gelatin to my initial pomegranate raspberry gel mixture because I decided just to pipe it straight in, but I did want that burst of like gooey, a different texture, something that was a little bit more reminiscent of maybe a vampire bite. And so, yeah, after I get all of these fillings in there, I'm going to sandwich them together, get them into my refrigerator, and let them mature. They will be ready to enjoy in about 24 hours. I am so happy with how this turned out. Usually I am not one to spontaneously make macarons that are this dark, and I don't work with pomegranate very much, and so I also really loved that in the story, especially because having a lack of food was something that was kind of part of this tournament to make sure that the vampires were really hungry and maybe more prone and likely to attack the humans and each other. So there really was not a lot of food to go off of or to be inspired by. So it really forced me to step outside the box here and create something that was inspired by this book, but was not just like, oh, they made this recipe, I made this recipe. So it was a challenge. I really, really enjoyed it. I also really enjoyed the book. It is the first book in a duet, so I am going to get into reading the second book. I like the first book well enough, so I will be continuing that. I had a little bit of a mishap with my computer and technology, so I was supposed to have a discussion. I did film a discussion with Sadie, and through my own error, I did not record it well enough. So if you stay tuned here, I'm going to get these macarons into my refrigerator to mature and then dive into them. And then I also have a short little discussion, a little overview of the book, but actually it is just by myself today, and hopefully I will get you a discussion with Sadie as soon as I possibly can, because she is such a wonderful person to discuss both macarons and books with. Thank you for staying tuned to the macaron portion of Maddie's Baking Book Club for this month. I hope you love this theme and look and flavor combination as much as I did. I was so happy with how these ended up. Look how cool they are. So epic and like kind of disturbing, but in the best way. All right, let's get into the discussion. Hello everyone. So I am coming to you from my family's cabin, so don't mind the new background there. I was supposed to be coming to you today for Maddie's Baking Book Club for July 2023 with Sadie, the Happy Mac, as you might know her over on Instagram or TikTok. And due to my own technological failings, our recording that we did earlier today did not work out so well. So Sadie and I recorded this great book discussion based on this month's book, The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. I have book 2 here. I didn't bring book 1 with me because I thought I had already finished our book discussion. But I'll give you a little snippet here. I did not do a sound test with her, and as a result, my voice was super loud, and on her end, I basically just picked up her background noise and you cannot hear her at all. So unfortunately, I am just going to give you a little overview, what I thought about the book, what she and I talked about together, and then we're going to have Sadie back for another book. I guess we'll have to have her choose another book, maybe early 2024. So first of all, let me give you a little taste of my failure of recording our book discussion earlier, just so you know that I'm not kidding you when I say it was unsalvageable, which is so disappointing because it was like more than 45 minutes of really fantastic book discussion. That is like very fishy, like that he wants to do this with her. So for this month, Sadie picked the book, and again, this is the second in the duet. It is a fantasy series about an alternate universe that has several clans of vampires. There are gods and goddesses, and then there are also humans. Our main character is a human girl, Araya. She is quite young. I think she's like 19, 20 years old. She's very young. And though she is human, the current king of the vampire clans, he took her in when she was very young. And so even though she's human, she's been trained by this very powerful man who is a very masterful warrior as well, and he's been training her ruthlessly to survive in this world that literally wants to eat her, and then also to compete in this competition. And so you basically jump right in with this book into this competition, and the winner is going to be able to ask for one favor from the goddess who, in her name, they're doing this competition. And it is very like Hunger Games style, in which there are several people from all these different backgrounds who start out, and everybody knows going in that one person will win and basically everybody else is going to die. So really high stakes, and you have this girl, this young, fragile human girl up against all of these other vampires who are very strong and very fast and hundreds of years older than her. So not a really great start. So throughout this book, some things that Sadie and I discussed that we really enjoyed is that there were some things that went really well. We have a really great world that's been developed. There's a lot of creativity there, a lot of thought put into it. It does get into the action quite quickly, which is great. You don't have a ton of lead up or anything. But at the same time, you know, we do have some of the more typical fantasy tropes, a lot of the same things that you might expect from a vampire kind of romance fantasy novel are kind of in this book. However, and spoiler alert here, the ending was really shocking both to Sadie and I, and in the end of the story, which again, we know is a cliffhanger for book 2, it is really quite surprising because the tournament ends right at the end of the book, and in kind of a twist ending, we kind of expect the I don't know how to pronounce his name, if it's Rain or Ryan, because it's like Raihn. call him what you may, pronounce that how you may. He dies, and Oraya, our main character, she wins, and as her favor, instead of merging her very, in the beginning we think limited, but as the book goes on we think more intense powers with her father figure, she uses her favor to save the life of her loved one. And her loved one turns around, comes back to life, kills the king, and takes power for himself. Not only that, now that the power of the king is gone, there are 2 new heir apparents, and this mark appears on you. And for the one clan, it becomes Oraya, our main character girl, and for the other clan, we find out that this other vampire, even though he was turned, he was not, born a vampire, he was created from a human, he is one as well. And so he then turns around and, after killing her father figure, forces our main character to marry him. So the end of the story is a huge cliffhanger, lots of stuff happening. But also, throughout the book, we've learned more and more and more with every chapter that this king and father figure is actually really not a great guy. He has actually been doing some really terrible things, not only in the country, but with our main character, and she is discovering that a lot of this was actually very traumatizing and was actually not so great. So as the story goes, we kind of like him less and less. So his death at the end was a surprise and is obviously traumatic for our main character, but is not necessarily the worst thing that could have happened. I would say that I was a little bit shocked, even though I knew it was a tournament where people were fighting to the death. I was a little bit surprised by how many characters, the sheer number of people who did die in this book, including our main character's friend, and entire towns were wiped out outside of this tournament. A lot of violence. But sometimes with this kind of romantasy or romantic fantasy novel, it can go in a couple different directions, either be really heavy on the romance or really heavy on the fantasy. And I think this one kind of walked the line, maybe a little bit towards less romance, but in general it wasn't like a romance with a couple fantasy elements. It was full on, let's see if it's in book number 2 also. There is a full-on map of the world in the front. There's a glossary of terms in the back. It is definitely fantasy heavy, and if you are into fantasy books or fantasy romance or vampires, definitely it's a book to check out. One thing that is a trope in a lot of fantasy novels, so it is not alone to this one, but Sadie and I had a good discussion about that I wish I could share with you, and I'm so sorry I cannot right now. I will do my best to record us better next time. But in this story, we have a girl who's so young and competing against people who are just so much stronger than her, of another species that are so much stronger than her. And that tends to be a really hard to believe storyline in so many fantasy series. And it just seems a little bit crazy that, that storyline is just used over and over and over again. And it's hard to believe every single time, especially because at the beginning of the story, this girl was not even sometimes able to access the powers that by the end of the story we know that she has. So kind of some confusing elements, a couple of points in the plot that were a little bit hard to understand, but in general it was a really good read. The first book is about 400 pages. The second book I think is closer to it's 600 pages, so a little bit longer, but all things considered for a thicker fantasy novel, not too bad. And the one thing I'm really excited about for this series, I did really like the first book, a lot of elements. The writing style was really lovely. The characters seemed very deep and complex. A lot of different things going on in the broader world, even outside of what we learned about with our characters, that I'm very curious about. All, I think, marks of a good fantasy novel, and I am excited to read book 2. I would say, and Sadie agreed with me as well, that if this were the beginning of a series that was supposed to be much, much longer, if this were going to be 6 or 7 or 8 novels in a series, neither of us liked it quite so much to commit to that number of books. However, knowing that it's supposed to end, it is a duet, this should be the end, knowing that it's just 2 books is kind of refreshing and satisfying for a fantasy that is in a world that is so complex and has characters and storylines and all of this that is so complicated. It is kind of nice to know that after the 2 books, that entire story will have wrapped up completely. So a few things that I'm really excited about reading in this next book are the world that we learned about in book 1 is completely turned on its head. There's a new ruler in place. Our heroine has lost a lot of the only, family that she knew of, even if it was very toxic family. She has this new relationship, but that is also seeming a little bit iffy. We know because it's romantasy that they are likely to end up with a happily ever after, but how they're going to get there is a bit up in the air. Our heroine in the first book, we know growing up that she was kind of trapped in her room, a little bit confined to this castle, and it seems like she's found herself back in that position again, yet she's learned a lot about herself throughout book 1. She's grown a lot. She has a lot more power, even if she seems like she's found herself in a powerless place at the moment. So I am very excited to see where this world goes, where our characters go, and how they get through these seemingly insurmountable problems that appeared right at the end of book 1. Another thing that we have in this story is that there are these gods and goddesses that seem to just like come in and dabble and kind of pull the strings, act like puppet masters when they want, and then they just leave and abandon all of the humans and vampires alike to just kind of watch everything burn. So I am also curious to see where that storyline goes, if we're going to see more of the gods and goddesses in book 2, or if that was more revolving around the tournament that was in book 1. We will have to see. So for my bake inspired by this book, I really did like the kind of traditional dark, moody vibes. So I wanted to create a really, really black macaron with a really red inside, which is where I got all of those themes from, kind of the vampire theme. And because our vampires in this story, throughout different fantasy novels and worlds, we get a lot of different styles of writing vampires. In this world, they did have wings, and so I wanted to create those wings. A lot of them were very black wings, but when the heir mark for who was next in line for the throne for each clan appeared, I believe, in red. And so there were kind of these defining features in red, which is the reason I wanted to have some of those feathers in my macaron design show up not only as black or kind of highlight gold, but with red as well. Again, I am so sorry I cannot share at this moment my discussion with Sadie with you guys. We had some really fantastic things to talk about and got off on some great tangents about this book and other fantasy novels. So I will still try to kind of figure out if I can salvage our audio quality, if I truly cannot, or even if I can. Definitely I will be having Sadie back. Maybe she can choose a book again for early next year, and I will make sure to do an audio check for that discussion. So for now, I did want to also mention before we roll into August, I did actually last minute change the book I want to use for August for Maddie's Baking Book Club. If you want to participate or read along with me, the original book I had chosen with my sister-in-law Caitlin for August was How to Sell a Haunted Mansion, How to Sell a Haunted House, and Caitlin read it, and we were hoping it was more of a psychological thriller. It is not. it is like gory horror. So we have both decided that we would rather read and discuss something else. So we've chosen The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. I am very excited. I have it with me. I'm going to be reading it, and then hopefully in the next couple of weeks make my macaron inspired by this book. And also in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be releasing the upcoming book list for Maddie's Baking Book Club for September through December. I'm really excited to share these upcoming books with you. I have them all planned out with all of my new special guests. I have some Japanese literature, Korean literature, historical fiction, more mysteries, a lot of different genres and themes coming at you. And I'm really excited to not only read all of these things and have some discussions, but also get into all of the bakes for these books as well. So if you are curious, stay tuned. I'll be posting that list in the next couple of weeks. Thanks again for listening to this, unfortunately, self-discussion of The Serpent and the Wings of Night. Definitely check out this duology if you are interested in fantasy and you haven't read it already. I will post a link below, both to Sadie, who was initially supposed to be in my discussion with me, and also to this book so you can find it online if you're curious and want to know more. All right, thank you for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.